Today, I'm going to take you back to the 50s. The 50s, the era of Eisenhower, McCarthyism, the Cold War, poodle skirts, leather jackets, and gyrating hips.
You ain't nothing
The 1950s overall was a pretty bland era for comic books, but if you look beyond those tame stories of 50s suburbia, you will see that, culturally speaking, the 1950s was actually a very complex time for the comic book industry. Today, I bring you the top 20 best comic books of the 1950s. Right here, right now, coming at ya. Hey all you suicide squatters, Dante D here, bringing you all another video, and welcome to the channel where we talk about comic books and other geek stuff. Before we get into our list of the top 20 best comic books of the 1950s, I kind of want to give you a little bit of background on the 1950s in comic books. Contrary to what some people think, the 1950s was actually a very interesting time in the comic book industry. You see this huge paradigm shift happening as the golden age of comics ended and the silver age began, and you also see superheroes returning to the cultural spotlight. At the beginning of the 1950s, there actually were very few superhero titles on the shelves. You see, after World War II, superheroes kind of lost their appeal, and you can kind of attribute this loss of interest to there being lack of a true enemy after the war. And what I mean by that is Captain America doesn't have the same effect stopping bank robbers as he does when he's fighting Nazis and Japs. After the war, there were essentially only three superheroes that survived. They were Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman, and they just barely survived. The newsstand shelves were pretty much covered with horror comics, teenage dramas, crime comics, romances, and other genres like funny animals. And when I say that superheroes barely survived, I really mean it. I know the Batman title was almost canceled on a few occasions, and I really think that this is because after the war, superheroes were never really the same. Before the war, superheroes were kind of seen as these anti-establishment figures, and they were standing up for the common people. But after the war, they kind of became figures that represented the establishment. I think this trend of pro-establishment that we see in 1950s comic books is due in part to conformity, which the United States government was really pushing at the time as a way to fight communism. See, when the Cold War started, one of the ways that the United States government fought communism was to just reaffirm their way of life and reinforce a socially acceptable American life. By the mid-1950s, horror and crime comics were a new trend in comics, and they eventually got the attention of a psychiatrist named Frederick Wortham, who published all the evils of not only horror and crime comics in his book, but the evils of comic books in general. And he talked about how they were essentially contributing to juvenile delinquency at the time. I know, it sounds ridiculous, but if you really want some entertainment one time, read some excerpts from his book called Seduction of the Innocent for a good laugh. His logic is so flawed that it is funny. As ridiculous as this book sounds, people listen to him, and comic book hate swept the nation to the point where the United States Senate subcommittee had a hearing on the effects of comic books on youth, and they had William Gaines as a speaker at this hearing. The result of all of this was the Comics Code Authority, which I'm sure you were all familiar with, and this was a self-governing body that made sure that comic books did not contain any content that would offend or mentally harm any readers. So with this code, horror and crime comics were out of the picture, and publishers needed to get creative in order to stay afloat. So they turned to superheroes to save them once again. Superhero stories at the time reflected the ideal cookie-cutter American way of life perfectly, and the stories became bland and were pretty much just a huge advertisement for 1950s suburbia.
Superheroes had become very tame. You know, you'd buy an issue of Superboy, and he would be like saving the class picnic by, using his super breath to cool the lemonade and his heat vision to get the hot dogs nice and sizzling.
I can't really blame DC Comics for doing these types of stories, just because I think they were doing it really just to survive. If you watch interviews with comic book creators from that time, they will tell you that they were really bored with the type of material that they were putting out there. They felt so creatively restricted. But they were doing this really to avoid the wrath of the socially conscious public that was tearing apart and literally burning horror and crime comics. DC Comics was the company that started the whole superhero revival, so clearly you're going to see a lot of DC books on this list, and no Marvel. Marvel didn't really get into the game until the 1960s, and they were in our 60s list quite a bit. So, sorry Marvel, you had your turn last time. It's DC's turn for the 50s video. And as always, the books that I selected to be on this list today were not selected based on value, and they were not selected based on best story or art or anything like that. They were selected based on cultural significance. So let's get into this list now. Coming in at number 20 from 1952, Tales Calculated to Drive You Mad, number 1. This was a humor satire comic book that was published by EC Comics, and it ran for 23 issues as a comic book before they changed it to magazine format. And I think the reason why EC converted it to magazine was to avoid comic book censorship altogether. And I think that was a wise choice, because that became the famous Mad magazine, which is still around today. Coming in at number 19 from 1959 is Our Army at War number 83, which features the first appearance of Sergeant Rock. Detective Comics number 225 is our first Batman book on the list, featuring the first appearance of the Martian Manhunter from 1955. Not my favorite character, not my favorite book, but still a really significant book from the 1950s. At number 17 from 1957, we have Showcase number 9, which is a very interesting issue. This is the Lois Lane tryout issue. I guess DC was trying to experiment to see if Lois Lane could sustain her own title, and it turns out she was popular enough that they did eventually give her her own title called Superman's Girlfriend, Lois Lane, and this is just a really cool cover. I love this cover because a little earlier I had mentioned that comic books were essentially kind of a commercial or an advertisement for 1950s suburbia, and this cover here illustrates that perfectly. From 1950, we have Tales from the Crypt number 20, which is the first issue of Tales from the Crypt. Previously, Tales from the Crypt is called the Crypt of Terror, and EC was actually notorious for doing this. They would just change the titles but not change the numbering, and they did this in order to save on postage, which I thought was really interesting. Number 15 from 1959, we have The Brave and the Bold number 25, which is the first appearance of the Suicide Squad, and I absolutely love the Suicide Squad. This is actually a really cool issue. I loved seeing the Suicide Squad in their earlier days, but I honestly think that my favorite run on the Suicide Squad is from the 1980s, featuring the first appearance of the League of Superheroes, which this is an awesome issue. I absolutely loved reading this issue, and it's a really, really cool cover, legendary cover, probably one of the best known covers from the 1950s. Action Comics number 252 from 1959. This is the first appearance of Supergirl, and this is another very well-known book from the 1950s, and actually a really huge key issue that is sought after by many collectors. But Supergirl, she is a very popular character that still continues to be popular today. We have TV shows, we have dozens of comics still in print with Supergirl in them, and she had her first appearance back in 1959 in this very issue. And you're probably like, I wonder why this is on here, but I bet you didn't know that this is actually the first appearance of the beloved Crypt Keeper, one of my favorite characters in comics and one of my favorite characters on TV. I just love the Crypt Keeper. I think it's really cool that the Crypt Keeper first appeared in a crime comic rather than a horror comic. You would expect him, I guess, to make his first appearance in a horror comic, but no, it was in this crime comic here. And he actually appeared in a tester story that Al Feldstein was doing at the time to see if kids would like horror comics. From 1958, we have Showcase number 13, which is the first appearance of Mr. Element, a Flash villain. I actually don't care too much for Flash villains, but the Flash is a really big player in 1950s comics. You're going to see a lot of Flash related books on this list because the Flash is pretty much what got the superhero revival going. You're probably starting to see a trend too. All of these like superhero type comics are in the later 50s, and all of the horror comics that have been on the list so far are in the earlier 50s. Really kind of shows you and illustrates that paradigm shift that happened in the 1950s. Flash number 106 from 1959. This features the first appearance of another Flash villain, Gorilla Grodd. And I think I'm saying that right. If I'm not, feel free to yell at me in the comments and correct me. But I think it's Grodd. I've always said Grodd anyway. But this is actually a Flash villain that I like. I know I said I wasn't a big fan of Flash villains, but I actually like this Gorilla. I think he's kind of a cool villain. Superman number 76 from 1952, and this is the first Batman-Superman team-up. And you're probably like, aha, I got you. Batman and Superman have teamed up before this. And you're kind of right, but you're kind of wrong. I actually looked into this quite a bit because when I saw this, I thought, okay, I thought Batman and Superman, they've appeared on covers together so many times, and that is true. In the Golden Age, Batman and Superman appeared on many covers together, but they never actually met within any story. So this is the first time that Batman and Superman team up within a story, not just on a cover. From 1957, we have Showcase number 8, featuring the first appearance of Captain Cold, another Flash villain, who actually is kind of cool. Kind of reminds me a little bit of Mr. Freeze. And I think his name's kind of lame, Captain Cold. I think they probably could have changed his name. I don't know. I'm not a big fan of that name. But anyway, he's a very well-known Flash villain, and this is another very well-known heavy hitter book from the 1950s. From 1951, we have Detective Comics number 168. This is probably my personal favorite on the list, and this features the origin of the Joker. I would love to have this book in my collection, but it's just too bleeding expensive. It's a cool cover, it's a cool story. I've read the story online and it's just wonderful, but I'm a huge Joker fan, and I like the whole earlier days of the Joker when he was supposedly the Red Hood. I just think it's really cool, and if you have this book in your collection, please let me know. I have to say I'm very jealous. From 1958, we have Action Comics number 242. This is the first appearance of Brainiac, a really big Superman villain, one of the best known Superman men villain, probably behind Zod and Lex Luthor for sure. Next on our list is another book that I wish I had from 1955, Batman number 121, featuring the first appearance of Mr. Freeze, or in this issue, Mr. Zero. He was originally called Mr. Zero, and then he was later renamed to Mr. Freeze. And I absolutely love this cover. Mr. Freeze is another one of my favorite Batman villains. After the origin of the Joker issue, I think this is probably my second favorite on the list, and I really wish I had this, but again, it's another quite very expensive book, and I love Mr. Freeze. I think Mr. Freeze is probably one of the most underrated Batman villains. I don't think he gets a lot of respect, and that's probably due in part to the Arnold Schwarzenegger performance from the 1997 Batman and Robin movie, which we all to this day love to roast. But I really hope that Mr. Freeze is given another shot on the big screen again sometime in the future.
In this universe, there's only one absolute. Everything freezes.
From 1954, we have Crime Suspense Stories number 22 with this famous cover by Johnny Craig, and this is the cover which is considered to be the one that started the whole crusade against comic books, and what really kind of captured Frederick Wortham's attention and inspired him to really examine the effects of comic books on youth. But this is just a great cover. I absolutely love it. In fact, at the Senate subcommittee hearing, they asked William Gaines if this cover was in good taste, and he said that yes, the cover is in good taste. The only thing that could make this cover be not in good taste is if you could see the blood dripping from the severed head. It goes without saying, because this cover was so influential, that it is hugely culturally significant and deserves a spot on this list. And now we get to our top 3 entries for this list. Coming in at number 3, we have from 1959, Flash number 105, which is the first modern solo Flash series. And you're probably asking yourself, if this is the first Silver Age solo series of the Flash, why is it number 105 and not number 1? And that's a very interesting question. I think that was asked to Carmine Infantino at one time, and he said that he decided to keep it number 105 as opposed to reverting back to number 1 because it made the comic book look more established and more popular. He said that people would think, oh, you know, it's been running for 104 issues, so, you know, must be a great book. I'm going to pick up the 105th issue. We have Showcase number 22, which features the first modern appearance of the Green Lantern, and I believe this is also the first redesign of the costume. In the Golden Age, Green Lantern had this costume here. He had a cape. It's really kind of dated, and then in Showcase 22, we get this new sleek, Atomic Age looking Green Lantern, which I actually really like Green Lantern's costume. I'm not a huge Green Lantern fan, but I think he has a really awesome costume, and I really like this cover for Showcase number 22, and definitely one of the heavy hitter books from the 1950s. And I'm sure you've already guessed our number 1 entry. From 1956, we have Showcase number 4, which is the first appearance of the Barry Allen Flash and the first modern appearance, Silver Age appearance of the Flash. This is probably one of the most culturally significant comic books, not only of the 1950s, but of all time. This book here is the book that pretty much ended the Golden Age and started the Silver Age of comics. And probably also, coincidentally, this happens to be the most expensive book on the list. If you eBay it, like I said, I'm not huge into values of comic books, but I eBayed it. I thought, oh, you know, maybe it'd be nice to own this. Maybe I'll splurge a little and drop a little bit of cash to buy it. Yeah, that's not happening. This book costs as much as an expensive sports car, and yeah, I never will own it. So pretty much just gonna have to keep reading it online. But if you have this book, I'd really like to hear from you, because this is an awesome book. Not because it's valuable and it's one of the most valuable books from the Silver Age, but because this is a piece of comic book history. Not only comic book history, but of pop cultural history. And I just think it is awesome, and it rightly deserves the number 1 spot on this list. So that does it for our list today. Really hope you enjoyed it. Do you agree with this list? Do you feel that there are other books that should have been on this list that were not? Please let me know in the comments. Until next time, this is Dante D signing off. I will see you all in the next episode.